Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of HR Tech Chat. And I am very happy to have with us today a very interesting guest. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with Ryan Anderson, who is VP of Global Research and Insights at Herman Miller.
Hey, Brent, thanks for having me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for agreeing to do this. This is going to be super interesting because a lot of people in our audience probably heard of Herman Miller. You're known for office design, office furniture, this sort of thing, but it's really so much more than that. And 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 in your role in Herman Miller's sort of place in the market has evolved significantly in very, very intriguing ways over the course of for lack of a more positive word, the pandemic. But maybe we could. I know that we spoke a few weeks ago, and you've been mentioning that your interactions with HR leaders has actually increased significantly, especially over this past first half of the year. Maybe what's going on? How is your role changing? What are these dynamics?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll give you some background first. You're right. Herman Miller is primarily known for modern design, for our chairs, in particular, our office chairs. We've been around a really long time. We actually started out making products for home. Then we got into office, healthcare, higher education, and we've essentially made products for people to support them in a really wide variety of areas. And we've had a research function for a long time. We formalized our research group in 1960. And that group started looking into future of work, future of workplace, way beyond the furniture. In fact, one of my favorite stories is when Stanford debuted the first personal computer to the world in an event known as the mother of all demos in the tech world. We designed the environment for it. So we've been looking into things like how technology impacts work and how that changes our built environment for a really long time. And my team continues that tradition. We're the global research and insight team. The research part is like the mining, it's the uncovering of hopefully the gold, which is the insights. And we do that for work. We've got a big project right now on future of home life. But in particular, you're right, the pandemic gave us a chance to revisit and share a lot of kind of our vision for where the workplace was going. It started out a long time ago, back in 1968. A kind of a predecessor of ours, Robert Probst, wrote this piece called The Office, a Facility Based on Change. It was a manifesto of sorts that was very human-centered. It was about how the environment could create more fluid, flexible experiences, enable change management, be more equitable. And then desktop computers rolled along and everybody got tethered to a desk, and those desks effectively became cubicles. And we kind of began revisiting our thinking about future office when mobility started to come around, 2005, 2010, we started to see the workplace becoming more and more dynamic. And we had this idea, and it was based on what we were seeing in the world, that yes, in fact, more flexibility was going to be the new normal. Offices were going to become more on demand. And that we would see this essentially hybrid work state unfold. I don't think we saw it happening nearly as quickly as what the pandemic accelerated. And the one big surprise for me has been the involvement of HR. Really pleasant surprise. Like I couldn't be happier about it, because for decades we wanted to elevate the role of workplace, and that's not just office. That could be work from home, it could be co-working, flex space, whatever. We wanted to elevate the role of that in terms of its value, its impact on people, its impact on engagement, the need to focus on inclusive and equitable experiences within the workplace. And we love the people we serve within facilities and real estate, but for better or for worse, real estate has often been viewed organizationally as a cost center. And so the people that we know and love there may be very passionate about the topic, but often they're measured on real estate costs. And so having HR jump into the conversation's been awesome. And I think in a nutshell, what has really happened is we saw this pendulum swing where only 18% of organizational leaders thought remote working was really viable before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit, we went into quarantine, organizations started to say, remote working seems to actually be pretty, something we could scale, something that we could keep. By the time fall rolled around, we were getting questions like, do we still need offices? And we've actually studied remote first companies since about 2013. So we say, yes, you'll still want offices. They're going to need to take on a different role. The good news is you can get more value out of them than what you once did. And by the winter, particularly in those climates where people were cooped up, it was like, I think everyone realized remote working is not necessarily a panacea, and they were beginning to seek more of a balance. And that forced the topic to shift from place to work, really future of work, thinking about what it takes to move into hybrid working and the whole host of things in terms of how we help work team leaders manage teams, how we think about cybersecurity, how we think about real estate investments. And actually, that's how our research is done. We focus on people, then process, then place. So we want those spatial insights to go create great furniture, but we get to them by having a deeper understanding of people and how they work.
Uh, so much in there. Let's unpack a little bit of it. So first of all, as you mentioned, work being not necessarily a place. It's work, you know. And I thought to myself, okay, how many people have stopped saying I need to go to work? You know, I need to start where I don't remember the last time I said I need to go to work because I work in the office, my office in the basement of our house. So I need to start working now. I've said that. I remember saying that yesterday morning. But that's really interesting to me. You know, another thing, just, a little curio here is you mentioned that your Herman Miller's research into this, your division, was sort of, I think I heard this correctly, it was founded in the early 1960s, and and it was looking at back then the future of work. That to me is amazing. Here I am, in my sort of my own little bubble in the HCM technology space, thinking that the term future of work was new. I need to read more books. um, you know, what now? But let's get into this idea of work being a thing versus a thing you do versus a place you go. And because it makes complete sense to me, this shift, it's not so much about your real estate, it's not facilities management so much anymore, but you're dealing with the folks have the greatest invested interest in making sure the employee experience is very positive. Maybe could you dive a little bit deeper into that?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a continuum here. You're right. People are by and large not referring to going to work as if it's a place as much. And I think beyond that, we're seeing more and more people beginning to think about work not even as a series of activities, but really focused on outcomes and productivity. And we're seeing a major move away from presenteeism, which is, I think, a good thing. I think there's quite a few solid pieces of research to indicate that presenteeism wasn't a particularly good measure of productivity from the outset. We're a founding member of something called Future Forum, which is a collaboration between Slack and Boston Consulting Group and Fortune Magazine and Herman Miller and others. And there's quite a few HR leaders involved. And one of them said, in a pretty straightforward way, we need to start thinking of work as outcomes, not activities. Stop measuring just if somebody's doing something and begin to move towards more goal-based ways of measuring if somebody's successful in their job. Because as kind of our work world becomes more flexible and in some ways more employee-centric, that means yes, more autonomy for the employees, but more responsibility. Like people have to step up to those whom much is given, much is expected. And as we see location flexibility becoming more reality, people have to take accountability for meeting their own goals. But there's always a spatial dimension to making sure that we're supported in doing our work. In terms of the process, there's how we work, there's the tools we use, and then we're always somewhere. And that somewhere can be really helpful. It can help us focus in on specific work activities. It can be healthy or unhealthy. And yeah, we spend a lot of our time trying to look at what those spatial dimensions are. Interestingly, the more we push the boundaries on where work can happen, the clearer our sense is of how each environment has to support it. So as an example, in the midst of the pandemic, we did a little collaboration with Nissan. They wanted to do a concept car, their Nissan Caravan 350, NV350, for the Toyota Auto Salon. And it was basically a van tricked out for nomadic work. Nomadic work is like the extreme edge of not having a work location. It's just hitting the open road basically, and living and going wherever you want and working along the way. And sometimes people would say to me, well, why are you doing that? Do you think minivans are the future of work? Well, transportation actually does support work often. Commuter trains, airplanes, autonomous vehicles probably will become places of work. But the answer was no. The more I understand how work can happen there, the more I can have a clearer understanding of what a work from home situation might be like, or what the office needs to do. So we shouldn't ignore the spatial dimensions. And the people we serve within facilities management, corporate real estate, commercial real estate, are super engaged and involved in making these transitions happen. But now they're doing it in much closer partnership with IT leaders and HR leaders. IT was kind of involved in a lot of ways before the pandemic, HR less so. And as I've mentioned to you, I've had more conversations and contact with HR leaders in the last 4 or 5 months than I'd had in the 25 years previously. That's not hyperbole or an exaggeration. The majority of people I talk to now are coming from HR, and I love it because the conversations are people centered, and they're about productivity and health, and the workplace. Again, the continuum of places we now call the workplace has always impacted those things. It's just organizations didn't necessarily unpack their old assumptions about where work can happen, and now they are.
You know what's interesting about the nomadic work, and you mentioned, so first of all, that's sort of my fantasy, is to get into an RV and just kind of travel the country and work, because I'll have I don't know, some crazy satellite internet hookup on the top of my Winnebago. Maybe it won't be a Winnebago, maybe something a little bit upscale, but anyway, I'm getting ahead. I don't, beggars can't be choosers, but anyway, but what you said about nomadic work, solving for the most extreme spatial working potential circumstances, right? And that way if you solve for that, then you'll be that much more able to just kind of like that solve for me working in my basement, or Jane Doe working in her her loft across town, or whatever, remotely for their employees. And that's interesting, because there's an analogy, and this may seem like a tortured one, but I don't think so, because I was just talking with a global payroll provider. We actually just did an HR tech chat with the chief product officer for a global payroll provider, and what they do is they solve for the strictest extreme, right, regulatory environment in any given in all the countries that they cover for global payroll. And I think it's 40 countries that they solve for global payroll. So they solve for the most extreme, the strictest regulatory environment of those 40 countries. And that way they know that they've solved for all 40. If they can provide a reliable auditable audit trail for that particular country, then everything else just flows. So it actually is. So if you're solving for the most extreme scenario, you're going to be able to solve for the average scenario pretty easily. What are some of the things that you're learning about making the? I love what you had to say, by the way, that everybody's is someplace all the time, right? It's true. Even when you're sleeping, you're in bed. I was trying to think, where am I not someplace? And I'm literally someplace all the time. What are some of the things that Herman Miller is learning about the workspaces, the evolution of, well, in terms of how to make that as conducive to work as possible, to outcomes-based work? Because I also like what you said around presenteeism being basically a poor predictor of productivity. It makes a lot of sense to me. Promptness is a big deal. It's when you have a place to go for work, and maybe it is an indicator, but presenteeism, you know, people are kind of working. I know my work schedule is uh is very fragmented. I have some time in the morning till 3 p.m. I pick up my girls from daycare, and then I get back to work from 4 to 6 or something like that, and then I work in the evening after they're in bed. So I've rambled a little bit, but
No, that's fine.
what have you
There's
learned about workspaces and making them more conducive, the evolution of the workspace, making them more conducive to outcomes based work?
Sure. Well, I think what we need to realize is that 30 years or so, when desktop computing was essentially the means by which we were productive, it caused people across the globe to begin to think that work happened in one place in a very predictable sort of way, because people didn't have that autonomy. And our work activities became more and more varied, and the tools that we use became diversified. But the assumption that it all had to happen in the office didn't change for a long time. So what happened was that the design of offices were essentially overburdened. And what I mean by that is, if I were to challenge you, Brent, to cook a meal that anybody on earth could eat anywhere at any given time for any meal, and everybody would need to kind of like it, you would end up being forced into creating something that was uniform, vanilla, and generic enough that it could kind of go anywhere. Or we could use the same analogy for like a piece of clothing. Like what could you wear in any climate, in any place? It would force you into something that is very, very generic and simple. That's what had happened with offices. It was like all of our activities are supposed to be supported there. But if you look at the design of offices by and large, they drifted into lots of open, smaller desks and lots of generic conference rooms. And if you were to look at a taxonomy of activities, and we have this from our research, so we could take a look at group activities like casual chatting or group co-creation, or presentations, like activities that we do all the time. And we were to say, well, what's a conference room good for? Long, skinny table, 12 chairs, monitor at the end with a video camera, whiteboards on a long end of the room. Is it really good for co-creation? Not really. No, because the room's stuffed with furniture and you can't move through it. Is it really good for presentation? Well, not great, because you can't really see each other. You're doing this bob and weave to try to make eye contact. Like, I can just go down the activities and say, this means of making these spaces more generic compromise their ability to actually do any specific activity with a degree of purpose. So what's been happening for a lot of years, actually, well before the pandemic, is that we're seeing work environments get more specific. Like, hey, let's really find a good place for people to do heads down, focused, concentrative work. Or let's find a great place for somebody to be able to have a really good moment of individual creativity or whatever. And so what that means is that organizations need to move away from the idea that you do all your individual work at your desk and all of your group work in a conference room. And there's like this diversification, which is kind of a revisitation of what I talked about in 1968, this idea of office as a landscape. Yeah. And now that thinking is just extended beyond the walls of the corporate real estate portfolio. We have a sense of what can be well supported in the office, but we also know that home needs to support some really specific activities. But here's the interesting thing. It's very, very difficult to actually say that any specific individual might do their work in a specific location, that location would be best for them on a given day, without having a lot of input from them. So if I were to take 100 people and say, where does this group do their best work? Job title, job function, work style really isn't going to answer the question for me. There's some organizational factors like the nature of their work, their team dynamics, their tool adoption, but there's a lot of personal stuff. And that's what you got to. It's your own schedule. It's your demands as a caregiver, whether you've got aging parents or whether you've got kids or pets. It's our individual abilities, our physical, cognitive, and sensory abilities that may impact where we are. It's whether we're introverted or extroverted. And so when you start looking exhaustively at the factors that impact where somebody can be productive, you'll ultimately go, I can't determine that. And so the end result is don't. Like, give people choice and then give them choices. And that's the path towards more equitable experiences. Now you got to trust your employees to, use those those resources. And it doesn't have to be pandemonium,
Yeah.
but being able to say, you don't just have to sit at that desk. You can choose anywhere within this facility, or you can choose one of these facilities, or you can choose one of our offices or home on a given day. It's on you, is the path towards much more equitable, healthy, and productive experiences across the workforce. And there are some specific groups that we identified in our Work with Future Forum that are asking for this most loudly. The two that we highlighted just last month in a blog post are working moms and African American knowledge workers, who said for different reasons that that additional flexibility of not needing to be in the office created better experiences for them. For the working moms, it was very much about that those caregiving demands. And when we saw some of these banks in New York say, remote working is an anomaly, we want everyone back in, it was largely the working moms that were like, hold up, like as a
Yeah.
CEO, you might have a nanny and a driver, but that's not my life. Like I need some flexibility in order to balance this. With African American knowledge workers, it was about representation. There's no head of a table on a Zoom call. The
Mhm.
need for code switching is reduced virtually versus in office. And so I think organizations, as they really begin to look at place, will begin to see that each of them shouldn't just be like a generic copy of another office. They
Yeah.
should have some intentionality to it. And there's some activities that people will prefer to do at home, others that they'll prefer to do in the office. We've actually gotten quite specific in the sharing of our research around, if you want to design an office for post-pandemic hybrid working, focus on these experiences because these are the ones that are toughest to do at home. And think about supporting these activities at home. We've got hundreds of customers that are now providing chairs, providing Wi-Fi routers and other things for their employees because they don't want to leave 40% of somebody's productivity to chance. So
Mm.
that was a long answer, but basically these spaces are becoming much more purposeful and less
Mm.
generic and more intentional. And if done right, it can actually save the organization real estate dollars while providing the employees far more choice.
Yeah, you did a real deep dive there into the emerging hybrid working hybrid scenario, which I do think is going to be, which I think is the future, the very near future, right?
Literally.
And yeah, I shared your, just I was taken aback when I saw some of these banks in New York that were saying, no, everybody has to come back to the office. I thought, what are you? Well, what are you thinking? I just didn't, and no, I did not understand that at all. It's some sort of, obviously they were thinking something, and it felt compelling to them, but I just don't understand it at all. Um, the
Well, I
Go
will
ahead.
jump in, Brent, and just say I do understand some of the leadership concerns about hybrid, and in particular around what does it look like to maintain a healthy, cohesive culture when you've got teams that are more and more distributed. But we need to remember that people like distributed working, the spreading out of work, that had happened since Wi-Fi. So
Yeah,
people well before 2020 were working from home and the coffee shop and the supplier and the co-working space. It's just organizations didn't necessarily have a strategy for dealing with this. And some organizations like those banks will take an office first strategy. And if they do so, they need to make sure those office experiences are amazing and that they cover off on as many experiences as possible. We've seen many of our customers, mostly leading tech companies, move towards a remote first approach where they'll still have offices, but home becomes primary workplace. But to your point, the majority are saying hybrid to some extent and wrestling with what that really means.
yeah, and making your office, if it's going to be primarily on site, right? Making sure this is the thing we talk about, investing in your employees, right? If you're going and investing in the employee experience, right? And nobody is saying there's necessarily a correlation between work from home and a better employee experience. In fact, maybe there isn't. We don't know. That's sort of just a thing that some people, oh yeah, better employee experience because you can work from home. Maybe not for everybody, right? But if you're going to mandate, or excuse me, require that they come back to the office, then you are still going to invest in the employee experience somewhat, somehow. You have this great resignation happening right now. It is happening, right? And so you need some way to entice employees to stay. And you're absolutely right. Designing that office, putting the money into that office so that it is an inviting place for them. I just want to go back to one thing that was super interesting to me. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I thought it was really interesting. You talked about cubicles, right? And I mean, there was a movie about the office space. I mean, about just the total just soul crushing life of working in a cubicle. We've all been there. And to me, it's interesting. The workplace you talked about, back in 68, I think it was, and this idea of the office of work being a landscape, right? But then the desktop computer kind of took over, and everything was built around, it's like workspaces were built around, accommodating the computer, this
Mhm.
this fixed ass, this fixed excuse me, well, at the time, actual desktop computers, not laptops. So they immove for the most part, immovable, not practically, like portable, like a laptop or an iPad or something like that. And so that kind of homogenized the design of offices, and there was little thought put into that because it was so IT driven in terms of you mentioned IT being involved in the process of making workspaces, right? And that's a very that to me is what the workplace looks like if IT runs the show, right? That's sort of the homogenization of the workplace. Maybe you can just go into that a little bit.
It's funny. I don't think most IT professionals knew the impact of their choices, particularly their network choices on workplace. And in some ways, IT led us into that era, but also led us out of it. So there was, and by the way, I'm a bit of a history geek. So, and of course, working in research, I can get super down a bunny trail here. But there was a movement after World War II in Germany known as Büro Landschaft, which was office landscape, and it was the origins of what we would call the open office. But it was just that it was a landscape. It was in some ways inspired by urban planning. And what would it look like for the interior of an environment to have this kind of interesting variety? And so when we invented the first modular furniture product, which is, we don't call them cubicles because that's not what we designed. What we designed were panels which were flexible, surfaces that supported work in a variety of postures. Sit stand is not a thing of the last 10 years. We were supporting standing work, sitting work from 1964 on. Um, it was a really rich, interesting environment. There was, if you look at the pictures of the time, there was a lot of color, there was a lot of movement, there was fewer right angles, it was less orthogonal and more varied. And it was specifically computer networks. It was Cat5 Ethernet cables leading to desktops, so that when I entered the industry in 1994, it's not an exaggeration to say the space was planned around the computer networks. You would look at a floor plan, say, where do the computers go? How do you route those cables? And the furniture became the infrastructure for bringing power and data to those terminals. And then the people got just placed in last. I mean, there was very little choice there. Now, for all that, the IT world, as it moved towards mobility, as it embraced consumerization, as we've embraced IoT. I mean, today, like, we have a sensor product that measures real time the use of space. Furniture has become an infrastructure for sensing now. So in some ways, it's all kind of reversed from that idea that it was a very static environment where the user had very little choice, and now it's evolved to no, it's a landscape again, and we need to support mobile tools, and we need to support smart working environments. And before I pause, I'm going to take a little digression back to your comment about employee experience and work from home, because I will say, I know many of our viewers here today or listeners here today probably have worked with Gallup in some capacity on employee engagement metrics. Many don't realize that Gallup has put out a piece called State of American Workplace every year. And if I go back pre-pandemic to the 2020 report or the years previous to that, there was a pretty tight correlation, not necessarily between engagement and specifically home, but engagement and choice of location. So if you look at the data, it'll show the lowest levels of engagement for those that work almost exclusively from the office or almost exclusively from home, the highest levels of active disengagement for those that are in one place or another. And in the middle, regardless of the ranges, the numbers increase. The engagement numbers increase, but the disengagement numbers decrease. And the basic takeaway is the more choice you give someone, the more engaged they're going to be. And we know the positive effects of engagement on organizational outcomes.
That's really interesting. It may also have something to do with people's appetite for the average appetite for face-to-face, interaction versus going back to, not everybody is a full extrovert and not everybody is a full-on introvert either. Most people are along the spectrum, so that might have something to do with it too. But it's very interesting choice, having the choice that to me is a that implies, I would infer that as freedom if I had the choice, right? I have some freedom here, and people love freedom. um, what I would like to get to go back to is what are these HR? I mean, I can guess what they're approaching you about, but what are some of the questions that these HR folks that you're increasingly interacting with? What are they asking you? What do they want to know? What are their challenges?
Yeah, most of the questions originate from things that aren't necessarily spatial. So we started looking at supporting distributed teams a long time ago. We did a deep dive with the head of user experience at Skype, as an example, in 2013 and 14 on the use of video. And I hired an applied cultural anthropologist to study, like, can people trust each other effectively on video, I think in 2014. So a lot of it these days is around, what does it look like if we just take a glance at other organizations that made this transition years ago for teams that are more spread out to maintain a healthy culture? What does it look like in terms of specific leadership skills or practices to help keep those teams thriving? What's the role of physical office environment in supporting people when and if they can work anywhere? But a lot of it boils down to employee experience. It's basically the realization that workplace experience is a subset of employee experience.
Mhm.
And what should the organization begin to do to think about creating spaces that are desirable? Basically, workplace is on demand in a world of hybrid working. And back in the fall when organizations were asking me more around, like, do we need offices? I would say, well, we've been cooking from home the last year, but nobody's asking if we need restaurants, because we cherish the experience of restaurants. What you're implying to me is that if you're questioning the value of workplace, it must not be a great experience because you're willing to let it go, and so are your employees. So we've seen examples, and we've helped to create environments that people love to go to. It's really epicenter of culture. And we talk a lot with HR leaders around more things related to organizational behavior. So theory X, theory Y, Douglas McGregor, what does it look like in a theory Y organization to support a workplace? The topic that I personally love talking about the most is Mark Granovetter's old framework of strong ties, weak ties. So strong ties are our immediate networks. They're the people that we're closest to, our friends, our close coworkers. Weak ties are our extended networks, our acquaintances, the people we don't see regularly, but they're really critical to our sense of community and culture. And what 2020 and the quarantine did, by and large, was it deeply strengthened the strong ties, right? So, like,
Yeah.
I know the names of my employees' pets. I know how much per piece of plywood one of my employees paid to get his roof redone. I know more about that group, and they know more about me than we ever dreamed. But there's hundreds of people in my extended network, my weak ties, that I missed without even realize I'm missing them. And it's very difficult when you're only using video or audio meeting tools to have any reason to encounter them. So most organizations, particularly leading HR individuals, are beginning to understand that their physical environments want to become the cultural epicenter of the space, that it's where weak ties flourish, that to get people into the office, it's kind of like going to a party. Yeah, I want to go to the party, but I don't want to go unless I'm going to go with somebody really close to me. So you need to both support, like, people's on-demand use of it as a team, as a close team, but you really want to get these different groups interacting with each other in different spaces. So the whole community socialization part, more immersive team activity stuff you can't do on an hour-long Zoom call, this desire to create more equitable work experiences. And then there's one topic we haven't talked about yet, which is applying universal and inclusive design principles to create a more inclusive physical environment, which even in the world of office design and interior design is still a pretty emergent concept. These are the most common things we're asked about, and we love
Yeah.
talking about things.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. One of the things you mentioned a moment ago, and we're starting to run out of time here, but one thing you mentioned was, the desire to go back to a workplace, to an actual physical space, and and we actually had a guest here on HR Tech Chat about a month ago. It was actually iSIMS, which is a well-known talent acquisition technology company, and they have their annual the class of report. So the graduating class, college class of that year, and the graduating class of 2021, and those people they don't those college kids that are getting out of school, they don't want to work from home. They want to have that experience. They want to go to the office. So we have to remember that too, right? It's very important that, there's sort of there's a rite of passage or a cultural experience, a shared cultural experience that in the world of work that we have to be very careful that we don't, sort of throw away inadvertently. Um, I guess it's just another compelling argument for choice, the hybrid workplace.
It
Yeah.
is, but I will jump in and say, under the kind of the guise of guideposts and guardrails, this is something we need to be a little concerned about. And there's some debate, by the way, and I find myself, it actually, Herman Miller, one of the ways that we uncover insights is we actually have a debating society. Like we actually want to go debate some of this stuff. And this topic of do young people trend towards wanting to work from home or the office is one that there's a lot of disagreement about. I will tell you the best data I've seen and the best anecdotal experiences I've had indicate that long term, the people that are most comfortable working from home are the ones with the most established networks, who are most grounded in the culture, who are most secure in their role. And that's not the new people to the organization, and that's not usually the young people. So I think the bigger risk in hybrid is that the people who should be helping to acculturate the new folks, the younger folks, are not present. And so at Herman Miller, we kind of have this don't be a stranger policy where it's, you don't have to come in to do your emails or meetings. You can sit literally and have coffee for 6 hours if you want. But if you're part of the company, you've been around for 15 years and you've got your network, please be present now and then to build into these people, to acculturate folks, to have those kinds of moments. I think that is something that we all need to be quite aware of. And I do fall under the camp of the younger people by and large want to come into the office. In fact, perhaps more so than the folks that have been around a while.
That's a great point. Yeah, you don't want just a bunch of young kids at the kids at the office, right? You want to have a blend of the various generations and some of the leaders of the organization, right? Mentors and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
so much that happens in person. Um, great, great conversation, Ryan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I mean, this has just been a fascinating discussion. I think that I know I've learned something today.
Well, I appreciate being part of it. We put out a lot of our research on our research tab on our website, but specifically around the topics we've discussed. If you just go to hermanmiller.com /future of work, you'll see a lot of the topics that we've discussed reflected there. But this has been awesome. I'm really thankful that you had me on.
Thanks, Ryan. We'll make sure to include that link in the intro for this when it goes live. Thank you.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks.